When you look back at the grand sweep of human history, um, the narrative we usually tell ourselves about our relationship with animals is, well, it's one of dramatic, forceful conquest.
Oh, absolutely. We love a narrative of dominance.
Right. You picture early humans on the steppes of Eurasia, like breaking wild horses.
Unlocking all that sheer kinetic energy.
Exactly. Or you imagine the domestication of the dog. Wolves creeping to the edge of the firelight, entering into this fierce, primal alliance to hunt alongside us. We're sort of conditioned to expect a loud, triumphant entrance into the human story.
Yeah, we really want the animals that shaped our world to feel like protagonists in a cinematic epic.
But then you open up the sources for our deep dive today, and you are confronted with an animal that entered our history in the most subversive, unassuming way possible.
Almost silently.
Yes, silently. They didn't arrive as conquerors. I mean, they were never our predators, and they definitely weren't our hunting partners. They just sort of entered our timeline head down, eating the grass around our earliest settlements. So today, we are diving deep into the world of sheep.
And the quietness of that entrance is precisely what makes their impact so staggering. Because they didn't offer us the speed of a horse or like the defensive aggression of a dog, we've historically really underestimated them.
We just relegate them to the background of pastoral paintings.
Exactly. But it was that specific, unassuming biology, their unique digestive architecture, and their profound instinct for social cohesion that allowed sheep to completely rewire human history.
It's wild to think about.
It is. I mean, they changed the geography of human settlement, the origins of global trade, and perhaps most uncomfortably, our foundational concepts of morality.
So welcome to a deep dive into what our sources term the shepherd's paradox. For this one, we're pulling from an incredibly dense synthesis of archaeological records, evolutionary biology, agricultural economics, and bioethics.
It's a massive amount of material.
It really is. Yeah. And our mission here is to trace how, over the course of roughly 11 millennia, humans engineered a wild, athletic mountain animal to become a creature of absolute, inescapable dependence.
Which is quite the journey.
Right. We're going to examine the biological mechanisms we manipulated, the planetary economies the manipulation built, and ultimately face the philosophical question of what we owe a species whose vulnerability we intentionally designed for our own survival.
Well, to map that out, we really have to strip away the modern image of the flighty pasture ornament. You have to rewind the clock to the early Holocene epoch.
So we're talking, what, roughly 10 to 11,000 years ago?
Exactly, 10 to 11,000 years ago, to the rugged, semi-arid mountain ranges bordering the Fertile Crescent. So areas that today encompass parts of Iran, Iraq, and Turkey.
Because the domestic sheep we see today, moving like slow clouds across a green hill, they're basically a biological fiction.
Yeah, they are an engineered endpoint. The original blueprint was something entirely different. Our ancestors were dealing with wild caprines, specifically the Asiatic mouflon.
Which is the primary wild ancestor of the domestic sheep.
Right. And if you found yourself facing a wild mouflon on a rocky ridge back then, you would be looking at a highly tuned survival machine.
Not a fluffy cloud.
Not at all. You'd be looking at an animal adapted to extreme verticality. The Asiatic mouflon is this lean, hyper-vigilant athlete. They have extraordinary vision and spatial memory.
I mean, they had to navigate sheer cliff faces just to evade terrestrial predators.
Exactly. And crucially, their coats bore absolutely no resemblance to modern wool. They possessed a hairy outer coat with a short, downy undercoat that naturally shed every spring.
Which makes sense. I mean, carrying 50 pounds of heavy, continuously growing fleece would be an absolute death sentence in that environment.
Oh, they wouldn't survive a week.
I want to pause on the environmental context for a second, though. Because humans in the Neolithic period, they were interacting with a wide array of ungulates, right? They were hunting gazelles, wild pigs, ibex.
Yeah, they had options.
Right. And they were also domesticating goats around this exact same time in roughly the same geographic area. But the evolutionary strategies of goats and sheep diverged in ways that completely dictated how early humans could exploit them.
That evolutionary divergence is fascinating. So, biologists classify goats as browsers. Their feeding strategy is vertical and highly selective.
So they're reaching up for their food?
Exactly. They stand on their hind legs to strip leaves from woody shrubs, vines, low trees. And because of this, goats evolved to be highly independent, fiercely curious, and just remarkably agile problem solvers.
They have this innate drive to investigate their environment.
Which makes them notoriously difficult to contain.
Oh, anyone who has ever tried to keep a goat inside a fenced enclosure knows this. They are essentially the escape artists of the agricultural world. They view a fence as like a puzzle to be solved rather than a boundary to be respected.
Yeah, their independence is their primary survival trait. Sheep, conversely, evolved as grazers.
Meaning they keep their heads down.
Right. Their morphological structure, so the shape of their jaw, the angle of their neck, it's all designed for keeping their heads down, cropping tough, fibrous grasses close to the soil.
But the true distinction, the trait that actually altered human history, is cognitive, isn't it?
Absolutely. The sheep's ultimate evolutionary weapon is their profound, hardwired instinct for social cohesion.
Which brings us to the flocking instinct. And I just have to point out the deep irony here.
Yeah.
In modern parlance, calling someone a sheep is like a devastating insult.
Oh, yeah. It implies you're a mindless conformist.
Right, completely lacking in independent thought. We use it to mock people who blindly follow the crowd. But when you look at the fluid dynamics of a wild flock evading a predator, it completely upends that cultural insult.
It really does.
Flocking isn't a symptom of stupidity. It's this incredibly sophisticated, decentralized neural network of survival.
Fluid dynamics is the perfect term for it. For a terrestrial prey animal operating in open or semi-open terrain, isolation is fatal.
A lone sheep is a dead sheep.
Exactly. Easily targeted, exhausted, and killed by wolves or large felines. But a flock operates on the principle of predator confusion. When threatened, the mouflon don't just scatter chaotically, they compress.
They form a tight, synchronized mass.
Yes, moving with this rapid collective intelligence.
It basically makes it neurologically impossible for the predator to lock its visual tracking onto a single target, right?
Yeah.
The shifting mass of bodies, the intersecting lines of movement, it just overwhelms the predator's optic nerve.
It's a defensive strategy that works brilliantly.
The flock becomes a physical shelter constructed entirely out of other vulnerable bodies.
And that requires a level of environmental awareness and physical communication that is just staggering. Each individual animal is constantly reading the micro movements of its neighbors.
Adjusting speed and trajectory in like fractions of a second.
Exactly. This biology of gentleness, this imperative to stay together at all costs, is what early humans observed. They realized that you didn't have to break a sheep's spirit the way you had to break a wild horse.
You just had to hijack their social instinct.
Precisely. If you could control the movement of a few led animals or establish yourself as the center of their social gravity, the entire flock would follow.
So you capture them, isolate them from the wild populations, and begin the slow, methodical technology of selective breeding.
But it's important to remember that the domestication process was not a sudden paradigm shift. It was a grinding, multi-generational effort.
And what fascinates me is that the initial human motivation had absolutely nothing to do with wool. Early pastoralists weren't like looking for a textile revolution. They were just managing risk.
Yeah, it was purely about caloric security.
Right. They were capturing mouflon to guarantee a walking meat supply, essentially creating a biological insurance policy against the unpredictable failures of early agriculture.
For the first few thousand years of domestication, humans were basically just culling the hyper-aggressive males and selecting for docility, manageable size, and meat yield.
It was only later that the focus shifted, right?
Yeah, the archaeological record shows that it wasn't until significantly later, around 8,000 years ago, moving into early European and Central Asian settlements, that we see the intentional genetic manipulation of secondary traits.
And this is where human intervention shifts from simple management to like profound genetic engineering.
Yeah.
Because the creation of the continuously growing wool fleece is a staggering manipulation of an animal's biology.
It really is. The wild mouflon, as we noted, possessed a coarse outer coat called kemp and a soft, insulating undercoat that shed naturally.
Right. So early geneticists, and I guess we should think of these early pastoralists as geneticists operating by observation, began selectively breeding mutant individuals that retained their undercoat year-round.
Exactly. And over thousands of generations, they effectively broke the biological mechanism that triggers shedding. They engineered an animal whose follicles produce continuous, unbroken strands of keratin.
You look at that from a human perspective, and it is a stroke of technological genius. You have suddenly created this endlessly renewable resource for textiles.
A literal wool factory.
Yeah, but from the perspective of the animal, it's a biological trap. We stripped away their ability to regulate their own body temperature.
We did. We engineered a creature that, if left to its own devices, will literally be crushed under the weight of its own genetic code.
Because the physical consequences of this trait are severe, right? A domestic merino sheep that escapes shearing doesn't just reach an equilibrium.
Oh no, the fleece continues to grow indefinitely. They suffer from acute heat stress. Their vision becomes obstructed. Their mobility is severely compromised.
Which leaves them utterly defenseless against predators.
Exactly. And they become highly susceptible to systemic infections.
It's the equivalent of, well, imagine designing a highly advanced machine that provides an incredibly valuable output, but programming it to self-destruct if the human operator doesn't perform intricate maintenance every single year.
That's a perfect analogy.
We didn't just domesticate the sheep, we institutionalized their vulnerability.
We established a permanent biological contract. The trait that fueled human expansion, the continuous fleece, became a lifelong obligation for human maintenance.
But to fully understand why humans went to such extraordinary lengths to engineer this animal, we have to look past the wool, right? We have to examine the astonishing biological machinery operating inside the sheep's digestive tract.
The ruminant digestive system. This is the hidden engine of human expansion.
It's a marvel of evolutionary biology. I mean, sheep possess a complex four-chambered stomach. The rumen, the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum.
And compare that to humans with our simple monogastric digestive systems. We are incredibly limited in what we can extract from the earth.
Yeah, if we attempt to consume tough, high cellulose vegetation like scrub brush, wild grasses, or dry weeds, we will literally starve.
Our bodies simply cannot break down the complex carbohydrate bonds of cellulose.
But a sheep is essentially carrying around a 50-gallon, highly pressurized biological fermentation vat.
Precisely. When a sheep grazes, it swallows the vegetation relatively unchewed. It travels into the rumen, which is this anaerobic environment teeming with billions of specialized bacteria, protozoa, and fungi.
And then they regurgitate it, right?
Yes, the sheep later regurgitates this fibrous mass. The cud chews it again to break down the physical structure and swallows it back into the vat.
And this is where the alchemy happens. Those microbes dismantle the cellulose molecules, converting them into volatile fatty acids,
Which the sheep then absorbs directly through the rumen wall for energy. The sheep is essentially farming the microbes in its own stomach.
and in doing so, they perform a planetary-scale geographic conversion. I mean, they take vast tracts of marginal, arid, or highly elevated land that is completely useless for human crop cultivation, and they metabolize it.
They transform inedible scrubland into high-density human calories in the form of meat and fat, and high-value commodities in the form of wool and leather.
This mechanism completely alters the trajectory of human civilization. Before the pastoral exploitation of ruminants, human settlements were largely tethered to arable river valleys.
Right, if you relied on wheat or barley, your entire existence was geographically locked.
You were highly vulnerable to localized drought, floods, or invading armies. Your wealth was static. But when you harness the rumen of the sheep, wealth suddenly becomes kinetic.
It becomes portable capital. A flock is an asset that can walk away from a drought.
Which is such a massive shift.
It is, and this mobility birthed the practice of transhumance, the highly orchestrated seasonal migration of livestock between distinct geographic zones.
Pastoralists would move their flocks into high mountain alpine pastures during the summer months when the valleys were scorched, and then drive them back down to the lowlands before the winter snows hit.
And this wasn't just a casual stroll. Transhumance carved the first major thoroughfares across continents. It dictated the flow of information, the exchange of early technologies.
And it necessitated the creation of complex legal frameworks, too. I mean, who owns the grazing rights to a mountain pass?
Exactly. Who is liable if a flock damages a sedentary farmer's wheat field during the migration?
We see the economic gravity of the sheep deeply embedded in the earliest human records. If you look at the clay tablets from Uruk in ancient Mesopotamia, dating back over 5,000 years, the origins of writing and mathematics are inextricably linked to sheep.
The earliest cuneiform scripts weren't poetry, they were ledgers.
They were temple administrators, meticulously tracking the movement of flocks, the yields of wool, and the distribution of rations to shepherds.
It is staggering to consider that the conceptual leap to written language was catalyzed by the bureaucratic necessity of counting sheep.
It really is. And that economic gravity only intensified as we move through history. You fast forward to the medieval period in Europe, and wool is the undisputed engine of the global economy.
The Cistercian monks in England are a great example. They transformed vast tracts of the British Isles into massive, highly optimized sheep runs.
And the capital generated from the export of that raw wool to the textile looms of Flanders, it effectively funded the construction of the massive Gothic cathedrals.
It financed the crown's military campaigns, too.
So the cathedrals are literally built on sheep. But the apex of this biological monopoly was undoubtedly the Spanish merino.
Oh, without a doubt. The Spanish crown, through a powerful association of sheep owners, known as the Mesta, controlled a breed of sheep that produced a fleece so exceptionally fine, so highly sought after across Europe, that it functioned almost like a reserve currency.
Wait, so the Mesta was almost like a wool cartel?
Effectively, yes. They held unprecedented political power. The transhumance routes of the merino flocks, the cañadas reales, were protected by royal decree.
The wealth generated by this monopoly was a primary economic engine of the Spanish Empire.
And the crown guarded this genetic intellectual property with ruthless efficiency. Until the 18th century, exporting a living merino sheep out of Spain without royal permission was a crime punishable by death.
Wow. They recognized that the genetic code of that animal was the equivalent of state secrets.
Exactly. And as European colonial powers expanded across the globe, the sheep was utilized as a vanguard of empire. The introduction of sheep to Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas fundamentally terraformed entire continents.
Often with devastating consequences for indigenous ecosystems and populations.
Although it is crucial to recognize how certain indigenous cultures absorbed and adapted this imposed biology, the Navajo Churro sheep is a profound example of this.
Right. Originally a rugged, multi-purpose breed introduced to the American Southwest by Spanish colonizers in the late 16th century.
Yes. The churro was deeply integrated into the survival strategies and spiritual cosmology of the Diné and Navajo peoples.
It wasn't just an agricultural commodity. It became the foundation of their renowned weaving traditions. The specific double-coated structure of the churro fleece was perfectly suited for the intricate, deeply symbolic textiles they produced.
The sheep became interwoven with their cultural identity, which makes the subsequent historical trauma even more devastating.
You're talking about when the U.S. government systematically slaughtered massive numbers of churro sheep in the 1930s.
Yes, under the guise of soil conservation. It effectively devastated the economic and spiritual core of the Navajo Nation.
It illustrates how the power to control the flock, to dictate its movement, its breeding, and its survival, is intrinsically linked to the power to control human populations.
The shepherd's authority over the animal mirrors the state's authority over the people.
Which perfectly transitions us into the psychology of this relationship. We spend thousands of years shaping the sheep's biology to serve our economies, but the sheer weight of that dominion fundamentally shape human psychology too.
How so?
Well, the origins of shepherding forced humanity into a posture of absolute authority over a sentient creature. I mean, we decide when they eat, where they walk, who they mate with, and exactly when they die.
It is an immense moral burden to wield that level of absolute control.
And human culture, faced with the psychological friction of dominating a gentle, defenseless creature, developed incredibly elaborate mechanisms of psychological distancing.
We couldn't just view ourselves as exploiters, so we elevated the sheep into the realm of the sacred.
We transformed the biological reality of the animal into this massive, suffocating blanket of symbolism. The lamb becomes the ultimate signifier of innocence and purity.
The flock becomes the metaphor for the righteous community.
Right, and the shepherd becomes the archetype for the benevolent king, or the divine creator himself.
The Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God. This symbolism permeates Western art, literature, and theology.
But our sources urge us to interrogate the dark underbelly of this metaphor. When an agrarian society elevates an animal to a symbol of pure, unblemished innocence, it is rarely doing so to protect the animal.
No, it is doing so to justify the harvest.
Exactly. We sanctify the victim to absolve the executioner. If the slaughter of the lamb is framed as a cosmic necessity, a divine sacrifice that brings order to the world or washes away human sin, then the actual visceral terror of the animal bleeding out in the dirt is erased.
The metaphor acts as a cognitive shield.
It's the moral danger of demanding that a living creature serve as a symbol for human emotional needs. I mean, a lamb does not conceptualize innocence. It does not consent to being a vessel for purity.
It is simply a juvenile biological organism experiencing its environment.
There is an exploration of this in the sources that profoundly shifts the perspective. It discusses how modern language continues to enforce this dissociation, We use culinary euphemisms to distance ourselves from the biological reality.
We order lamb or mutton off a menu, reducing the animal to a category of protein.
But the stark, unvarnished truth is that a lamb is a baby sheep. It is an infant creature, usually less than a year old, that was separated from its mother and systematically killed.
Confronting that linguistic sleight of hand forces a reckoning. It asks us to consider how deeply modern industrial society relies on the systematic extraction of life from these animals, even while we rarely encounter them in our daily lives.
And the scale of that extraction is entirely invisible to the average person. We think our relationship with sheep ended in the agrarian past, but they are deeply embedded in the material reality of the 21st century.
Oh, absolutely. The most obvious products are meat and dairy. While sheep milk accounts for a tiny fraction of global dairy output, its chemical composition is exceptionally high in fat and protein solids.
Which makes it irreplaceable for the production of culturally significant high-value cheeses. You cannot manufacture authentic Roquefort, Pecorino Romano, or Manchego without the specific lipid profile of sheep's milk.
But the hidden byproducts are everywhere. Let's look at lanolin, for instance.
Right, this is the natural, waxy substance secreted by the sebaceous glands of the sheep to waterproof their fleece.
Exactly. When raw wool is scoured and processed, the lanolin is extracted, refined, and heavily integrated into modern pharmacology and cosmetics.
If you look at the ingredients of premium skin creams, intensive lip balms, nursing ointments, or even the industrial lubricants coating heavy machinery, you are interacting with the lipid secretions of a sheep.
The animal's biology is literally smeared across our faces and running our engines.
And then there is the wool itself, which represents one of the most bizarre and dysfunctional economic realities of the modern agricultural sector.
It really does.
For millennia, as we discussed, wool was the foundational textile of civilization. But in the mid-20th century, we developed synthetic, petroleum-based polymers. We invented polyester, acrylic, and nylon.
We replaced a complex biological fiber with extruded plastic.
And the economic shockwave of that technological shift fundamentally broke the biological contract we established with the sheep. This is the crux of the modern tragedy.
Because we engineered these animals so they must be shorn, we permanently deactivated their ability to shed.
But the global commodities market no longer places a premium on their fleece outside of highly specialized fine merinos. The proliferation of fast fashion, which relies almost entirely on dirt-cheap synthetics, has cratered the value of standard commercial wool.
The economic math is grim. In many regions today, a farmer must pay a specialized, highly skilled shearing crew to physically wrestle and shear their flock.
And the labor cost of that shearing frequently exceeds the market value of the raw fleece.
It's a net loss.
I want to make sure the sheer thermodynamic absurdity of this is clear to you listening. Imagine operating a massive manufacturing plant that produces a specific material. The global market suddenly decides it doesn't want your material anymore. The price drops to practically zero.
But because of a bizarre, unbreakable design flaw in your machinery, if you stop the expensive, labor-intensive extraction process, the factory will literally explode.
That is the reality for the modern shepherd. The wool has become a stranded asset, a byproduct of biological necessity rather than a driver of profit.
The farmer is trapped by the genetic legacy of their ancestors' engineering. They must absorb the financial loss of shearing simply to keep the animal alive.
In the environments we construct to manage these animals while extracting these increasingly devalued products are fraught with brutal ethical compromises. Let's critically examine the architecture of modern farming systems.
Because the cultural imagination tends to polarize this, we picture either a utopian, sun-dappled pasture or a dystopian, mechanized nightmare.
The reality is a spectrum of deeply compromised environments, each with its own specific physical and psychological trade-offs. The two extremes of this spectrum are massive open-range pastoralism and concentrated animal feeding operations, or intensive confinement.
Right.
I actually want to defend the logic of intensive confinement for a moment, because it forces us to confront the cruelty of nature. The public recoils at the idea of sheep, housed entirely indoors in climate-controlled barns on slatted floors. It feels unnatural.
It does.
But let's look at the alternative. If you run a flock on 10,000 acres of open, rugged range, you are subjecting those animals to the absolute brutality of the wild. You are accepting that a significant percentage of your flock will freeze to death in sudden spring blizzards.
Or that lambs will be torn apart by coyotes, wolves, or golden eagles.
Exactly. You are accepting that a ewe might break her leg in a ravine and slowly die of dehydration over 5 days because you can't find her. Isn't a sterile, predator-free barn objectively more humane than the terror of the open range?
You are outlining the core argument for confinement. It maximizes biological security. You eliminate predation, you optimize caloric intake, and you can intervene medically the moment an animal shows clinical signs of distress.
But there's a downside, obviously.
There is. You are ignoring the psychological concept of the animal's subjective experience of the world.
How does the high wilt of a sheep fundamentally clash with confinement?
Well, a sheep is not a static machine that simply requires fuel and safety. Millions of years of evolution have wired their brains to perform specific, continuous behaviors. They are driven to graze, to select different forages, to move constantly across varied terrain, to establish complex spatial hierarchies within the flock.
And when you lock them in a high-density static environment, you strip away their entire behavioral repertoire.
Exactly. They suffer profound psychological deprivation. Furthermore, the physical environment of confinement introduces new, insidious pathologies. The continuous exposure to high concentrations of ammonia from concentrated waste damages their respiratory tracts, and standing perpetually on damp bedding or metal slats leads to agonizing necrotic hoof infections like foot rot.
So open-range ranching provides immense behavioral freedom, but subjects them to horrific physical risks, while intensive confinement provides absolute physical security, but inflicts severe psychological trauma and environmental disease.
There is no utopian system. Every method of mass agriculture requires the human operator to choose which form of suffering they are willing to tolerate in the animal.
Which is why the ethical baseline of any system relies entirely on the literacy and the physical endurance of the human beings operating it. A flock requires a shepherd who can read the incredibly subtle, deeply suppressed signals of distress in a prey animal.
And that brings us to the human toll.
The labor required to maintain this biological infrastructure is staggering, largely invisible to the consumer, and psychologically grueling. Let's look at lambing season, which is the crucible of the pastoral year.
It is an endurance event that pushes agricultural workers to the absolute brink. During lambing, a farmer might operate on 2 hours of sleep a night for a month straight.
The physical reality involves working in freezing, wet conditions, constantly monitoring pregnant ewes for dystocia-obstructed labor.
You are physically intervening in the birth process. You are manipulating malpresented lambs inside the birth canal. You are dealing with ringworm, where the cervix fails to dilate.
And once the lamb is born, you are frantically working to prevent hypothermia, tube-feeding colostrum into the stomachs of weak newborns.
And aggressively treating navel ill, a lethal bacterial infection that travels up the umbilical cord.
And this intense, desperate care creates a profound psychological dissonance. The farmer expends massive emotional and physical energy to pull a single lamb back from the edge of death, fully knowing that within 6 to 8 months, they will load that exact same animal onto a transport truck destined for a commercial slaughterhouse.
The human mind is not designed to easily reconcile that level of devoted care with ultimate systematic betrayal. You have to actively dissociate.
You have to view the animal as a beloved dependent on Tuesday and an economic commodity on Wednesday.
And that psychological dissociation becomes violently acute when we look at the end of the supply chain, the slaughterhouse workers.
The industrial processing of these animals requires human beings to engage in repetitive, high-speed dismemberment. The occupational hazards are severe.
The ergonomic destruction of the human body from wielding heavy knives thousands of times a shift, the constant exposure to pathogens, the deafening noise of the kill floor.
The sources highlight the severe psychological trauma endemic to this labor force. Operating the captive bolt gun, severing the carotid arteries of conscious or semi-conscious animals hour after hour, it induces deep psychological scarring.
We see elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse among slaughterhouse workers.
The system relies on a double extraction. It extracts the biological life of the animal, and it extracts the psychological and physical health of the marginalized human labor force.
And this massive engine of extraction is driven entirely by the ruthless, unyielding mathematics of the modern consumer economy.
It is a financial trap that begins at the farm and ends the supermarket checkout. Let's analyze the economic forces crushing the primary producer.
The input costs for a sheep operation are astronomical and increasingly volatile. You have the fixed costs of land access and property taxes.
You have the variable, highly unpredictable costs of supplemental feed, which can bankrupt a farm during a multi-year drought when hay prices quadruple.
And you have the rising costs of specialized veterinary pharmaceuticals.
Yet the farmer has virtually zero control over the price they receive for their output. They are selling into a market defined by monopsony, a market condition where there are many sellers but only a few massive, consolidated corporate buyers.
These massive meatpacking conglomerates dictate the price.
Furthermore, domestic farmers are constantly undercut by aggressive international imports from countries with massive scale advantages, like New Zealand and Australia, or nations with drastically lower labor and environmental regulations.
So the farmer is pinned between skyrocketing input costs and artificially suppressed commodity prices.
And into this brutal economic reality steps the modern, conscious consumer, armed with what the sources identify as the impossible wish.
The modern consumer approaches the supermarket demanding a trilemma that defies the laws of economics. They want the meat to be ethically raised, meaning low-density, pasture-based systems with high welfare standards.
They want it to be environmentally regenerative.
And, crucially, they demand that it be cheap.
But the math is an illusion. You cannot have all three. If you see a product on a supermarket shelf that claims to be ethically raised and environmentally sustainable, but the price point is incredibly low, the consumer is being lied to.
The true cost of that item hasn't vanished. It has just been subsidized by someone or something else in the supply chain that the consumer cannot see.
Exactly. That low price is subsidized by the farmer deferring maintenance on their equipment and working 80 hours a week below minimum wage.
It is subsidized by the slaughterhouse worker denied a living wage and basic safety equipment.
Or, most frequently, it is subsidized by the degradation of the ecological environment.
Which brings us to the environmental impact of the flock. Because the biological engine we discussed earlier, the rumen, has profound consequences for the global climate.
Right, the process of enteric fermentation that allows the sheep to digest cellulose produces a significant byproduct, methane.
Methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas with a warming potential dozens of times greater than carbon dioxide in the short term.
While sheep populations emit a fraction of the methane produced by the global cattle industry, they still represent a measurable input into the anthropogenic climate crisis.
But the physical impact of their grazing behavior is equally complex. When an economically desperate farmer overstocks a piece of land exceeding its carrying capacity, the sheep act like a slow-moving ecological disaster.
They graze the vegetation down to the bare root. They compact the soil with their hooves, destroying the microscopic fungal networks that retain water.
The exposed topsoil is scoured away by wind and rain, leading to severe erosion, the collapse of riparian zones along rivers, and ultimately, desertification.
However, we must apply nuance here. Because the sheep itself is not inherently destructive, it is a biological tool, and the impact depends entirely on the management paradigm.
When integrated into rotational or holistic regenerative grazing systems, the flock becomes an engine of ecological restoration.
In these systems, the sheep are moved rapidly across small paddocks, mimicking the historic migrations of wild herds chased by predators. They aggressively graze the forage, trampling the unpalatable weeds and working their nutrient-dense manure directly into the soil surface.
Then, crucially, they are removed, allowing the land a long period of deep rest and regrowth.
This pulse grazing stimulates root systems, actively draws down atmospheric carbon into the soil profile, and increases the water-holding capacity of the land.
They can be used to manage invasive plant species, reduce the fuel load in wildfire-prone landscapes, and maintain biodiversity in ecosystems that co-evolved with large herbivores.
The critical variable that determines whether the sheep is a destroyer or a restorer of ecosystems is movement, and this is where human geopolitics collides disastrously with animal biology.
The sources point out that some of the most severe environmental degradation attributed to pastoralism in regions like sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East is not caused by the animals, but by the invention of the fence.
The drawing of arbitrary national borders. When colonial powers or modern states draw hard borders across historic transhuman migration routes, they trap the nomadic pastoralists and their flocks.
The animals can no longer follow the seasonal rains. They are locked into a static geography.
A biological system that evolved to be kinetic is forced to become sedentary, and it rapidly consumes the localized ecosystem. We blame the sheep, but the true ecological catastrophe is the political restriction of movement.
We're constantly trying to force ancient biological imperatives to conform to modern, rigid structures. And when biology resists, our default solution is often to apply technological interventions that introduce entirely new ethical dilemmas.
This collision between biology and modern efficiency is most starkly visible in the welfare procedures we utilize to keep the flock alive in massive industrialized systems. The controversy surrounding tail docking and mulesing is the perfect example of this ethical knot.
Mulesing, practiced primarily in the Australian merino industry, involves surgically removing strips of wool-bearing skin from the rear of the sheep.
It creates a smooth, scarred area of bare skin. It is an incredibly painful, traumatic procedure for the animal.
To a consumer, it looks like barbaric mutilation. But if you talk to the farmer performing it, they view it as a desperate, necessary evil to prevent a far worse fate: fly strike.
Let's talk about fly strike because it is horrific. Lucilia caprina, the blowfly. Because we genetically engineered the merino to have dense, heavily wrinkled skin to maximize wool production, moisture and feces easily become trapped in the folds around the breech.
The blowfly lays eggs in this warm, damp environment. When the maggots hatch, they release enzymes that liquefy the sheep's tissue.
They literally eat the animal alive. A sheep suffering from systemic fly strike will endure an agonizing, protracted death.
So the farmer is trapped in a horrific ethical calculus. Do I inflict acute, severe pain on this animal now through mulesing? Or do I expose my entire flock to this statistical probability of being eaten alive from the inside out?
We created the genetic defect, and our solution is to surgically alter the animal to survive the defect.
The agricultural technology sector is attempting to solve these intractable issues through the application of precision data. We are seeing a massive influx of ag tech into pastoralism.
We have drones utilizing thermal imaging to locate lost animals on vast ranches.
We have GPS collars that administer auditory cues and mild electric shocks to create virtual fences, allowing farmers to implement complex rotational grazing without miles of wire.
We have AI-driven auditory sensors in barns that can detect the specific cough associated with a respiratory outbreak days before human observation.
But I have to push back on the idea that turning the flock into a data node inherently improves welfare.
Does strapping an RFID tag and a biometric sensor to a sheep actually make the farmer more compassionate? Or does it permanently sever the emotional, tactile connection between the shepherd and the animal?
If you are managing your flock by observing a dashboard of behavioral metrics on a screen in an office, the sheep ceases to be a living, breathing organism. It becomes a data point.
It optimizes the extraction process, but it deepens the psychological dissociation.
It replaces husbandry with engineering. And this tension forces us to differentiate between the concepts of animal welfare and animal rights, which our sources define as fundamentally distinct philosophical frameworks.
Animal welfare, the paradigm that governs modern agriculture, concedes that humans have the right to utilize and consume animals, but dictates that we must minimize their suffering, provide adequate biological conditions, and ensure a swift, painless death.
Welfare is about making the cage as comfortable as possible and the bolt gun as precise as possible. It doesn't question the fundamental premise of ownership.
Exactly. Animal rights, however, attacks the foundational premise. It asks, by what moral authority do we claim the right to subjugate a sentient species, regardless of how gently we treat them?
If an animal has a subjective experience of life, why does human preference, our desire for a specific cheese or a wool sweater, supersede their right to exist free from exploitation?
And for thousands of years, that was purely a philosophical debate because we physically needed the animal to survive. But we are rapidly approaching an event horizon where technology might render the sheep completely obsolete.
The advent of cellular agriculture and precision fermentation, we are developing the capacity to bioengineer microbes to produce the exact lipid profile of sheep's milk without ever breeding a ewe.
We can cultivate the keratin proteins of wool in bioreactors. We can grow lamb tissue from self-replicating stem cell lines.
We are on the verge of being able to perfectly synthesize the outputs of the sheep, completely eliminating the need for the slaughterhouse, the confinement barn, and the shears.
It is the ultimate technological solution to the ethical problem. But if we follow that logic to its conclusion, the implications are staggering. If we replace the flock with the bioreactor, we don't just save the sheep, we functionally erase them from the human narrative.
If the economic incentive to maintain the global population of roughly 1 billion domestic sheep vanishes, the vast majority of that population will cease to exist.
And with them goes the pastoral cultures, the nomadic traditions, the immense landscapes that have co-evolved with grazing herbivores for 10,000 years. We solve the moral crime of exploitation by committing a slow, managed extinction.
It brings us to the ultimate realization of the shepherd's paradox. The word stewardship is frequently deployed by agricultural industries to imply a noble, protective relationship.
But stewardship in the context of domestication is largely a euphemism for total dominion, unless it is constrained by a profound, agonizing sense of moral responsibility. We owe these animals a debt that can never truly be repaid, precisely because we systematically dismantled their wild independence.
We didn't just capture them, we recoded their DNA. We broke their ability to shed their coats. We hijacked their social instincts.
We engineered them into a state of perpetual, inescapable childhood, entirely reliant on our intervention to survive another season.
We made ourselves gods to a creature we designed to be utterly helpless without us.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final image to anchor this deep dive. Picture a single sheep standing at the periphery of a flock as the evening light fades. Look past the pastoral cliché. Recognize that his physical body is an archive of 10,000 years of human ambition.
Its heavy, unbroken fleece is the physical manifestation of our endless desire for wealth and warmth.
The multi-chambered stomach quietly fermenting grass is the biological engine that carried our ancestors across continents. Its intense neurological need to press its body against the flock is the last echoing ghost of the wild mouflon on a sheer cliff face.
But I want you to consider a scenario that extends beyond our previous discussion of lab-grown replacements.
Consider the feral sheep populations that currently exist on isolated islands, like the massive horned sheep of Santa Cruz Island off the coast of California. These are domestic sheep that were abandoned by human industry centuries ago and left to their own devices in harsh environments.
They are the ultimate test of the biological contract we wrote. When the shepherd vanishes, when the code of engineer dependence is abandoned to the raw mechanics of natural selection, what happens?
The feral sheep rapidly shed the traits we prized. Over a few brutal generations of massive die-offs, they lose the heavy wool. They become lean, aggressive, and wild again. They actively undomesticate themselves.
It's just a final provocative thought regarding the shepherd's paradox. Perhaps our greatest moral failing wasn't that we exploited the sheep.
Perhaps our greatest arrogance is believing that the dependence we engineered is permanent. If human civilization were to fracture, or if we simply decided to walk away from the pasture, the sheep wouldn't politely fade into extinction.
The survivors would violently strip away the gentle, compliant identity we forced upon them and return to the mountains as the fierce, untouchable athletes they were always meant to be.
The wildness is never truly gone. It is just buried under 10,000 years of human convenience. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you find yourself wearing a heavy wool sweater against the winter cold, take a moment to feel the weight of it. You aren't just wearing a garment, you are wrapped in a biological contract written in the dual past with a quiet animal that gave up its wildness that we could conquer the world.